Dr. Mumwanzao, I'll start with a question that Ahmed asked you. Are you from Makweli?
No.
Okay. So we're discussing Robert Mugabe.
That's right.
We had from our resident analyst. Now I'd like to hear from Dr. Nzao. How do you remember Robert Mugabe? Was he a libertarian or a tyrant?
Well, he's a liberation icon. You know, from the training grounds of Munduli to the fields of where liberation fighters were trained in Ethiopia, to down to Quinto Canavale, where the liberation fighters were fighting the regime in South Africa and all this. His footprint is all over, and they respect him for that. They won't look him in the eye for that. They respect him, and it's a big sacrifice. He was jailed for 10 years for it, and he is a scholar and an intellectual in many ways. But sometimes when we react to wrongs that have been done to us in history, sometimes they say two wrongs don't make a right and so on. So the genius of Mandela, for instance, was that people wanted, some people wanted him to revenge against all the bad things were done to the black people. Historically, there is no race that has suffered mistreatment than the black race. It cannot be written. Slavery and all those things that were done by the Caucasian race and the Arab race to the African. But you cannot correct that by doing the wrong things. And so there may have been some transgressions on his part, some misgivings. But if some people had promised him that they would give him money so that people who needed some land, he can purchase it, willing buyer, willing seller. That is what President Kenyatta did here with the white settlers. And he had some funding for it, and he did it well. And we have so many, remember there are Europeans, white people who were born there, and they're Zimbabweans, just like we have our own Mzungu who are Kenyan. So people have to respect that, and probably the best thing for African leaders or our African countries is to learn from the Zimbabwean experience. South Africa is facing problems, and if it doesn't handle it well, some people might mistreat others there, and so on. So it is important that, for example, the genius of Mandela, people take it up that way, and so on. Because there are some things that he may have overreacted or done them unprocedurally, but that is a product of history. But how well you handle it is important, so that we build a better world.
Well, you call it the genius of Mandela. I'm going to be a bit controversial here. Is it xenophobia?
No, xenophobia is xenophobia is about reaction to is sort of okay.
Malema called it criminality.
Yeah.
But in terms of you say it was genius of Mandela
is because Mandela.
But this is it a manifestation of an equality that was never addressed?
Yes, and that's why I'm saying President Mandela went to the Springboks and to watch white people play and all this. And some people were not happy. They thought you should come back and punish people who have mistreated us for so long. But
didn't Mugabe try and solve that problem by evening out the playing field?
For it, yes, good. But how he went about it, that's what I'm talking about. How he went about it did not leave a very good picture. So how we handle problems, some of them are purely a product of history. Let me tell you, there is no colonialist who came asking for land by just or bought land. They just killed people to get this land. They did bad things. But President Kenyatta, for example, came back and said, I have this amount of money, willing buyer, willing seller. You can do this. President Mandela said, let's live together. Let's, if you need something from someone, buy it from them. Don't be racist.
Okay.
So that is the way we should go.
Dr. Kanenje,
Yeah.
I mean, is it a Western narrative? Was he demonized by the West because he refused to play ball?
Yeah, very good question.
Yeah, actually, that is a very good question.
Yeah.
You know, the interesting thing in life is, you know, how the story ends sometimes determines the perception people are going to have. But I think when all is said and done, I think Mugabe is going to be remembered a lot more favorably than he actually is remembered today. And the challenge, you know, he's a product of African history and African struggle for freedom. And it's true that he dared mess up with people who were not supposed to be touched. In early 2000s, just before the beginning of the invasion of white-owned farms, about 5,000 farmers, white farmers in Zimbabwe, controlled about 85% of the arable land. You know, those are facts, they're not opinions. You cannot sustain something like that. And of course, we know the process was different. Kenyatta was not just so generous and that he went and Ikiambwan dug out some money. No, yet we advanced some money to be able to do that. This is not something that was extended, or at least the promise that was not fulfilled with regard to Zimbabwe. And I think increasingly, when Mugabe started facing opposition, we just happened that it was a time when most of Africa actually was allowing multipartyism, and the rest of the world demanded more accountability and more political pluralism. I think Mugabe saw it as a Western plot and as a way to hit back, because you're having, at the time, around 12 million Zimbabweans, who most of them were dispossessed. They didn't really have much. They were mostly squatters. That perhaps as a way to survive, I'm going to have to turn this against them. So you create the otherness, us versus them. And the trouble is, the way he went about it was absolutely disastrous. Zimbabwe used to be the breadbasket of Africa. It was one of the countries that people were proud of.
Yes.
Mazrui, in his 1986 PBS series, The Africans, actually talks fondly about Zimbabwe. But then you have the internal dynamics that moving away land, you know, it's not bad to expropriate land of people who perhaps you feel that fairly got it, to give it to the majority. The trouble is, when you did in a wrong way, for instance, agriculture collapsed. Inflation went through the roof. They had $1 trillion note, you know, it was crazy.
It was a disaster.
It's a disaster. But the land problem is not just something exclusive to Zimbabwe. Even in this country, we actually have
the
challenges
same
of
problem,
land.
yes.
South Africa, the legacy of apartheid,
Has brought
part of this
xenophobia.
challenge
Yes.
that we're facing today in South Africa
Because
is
of land.
traced back,
Yeah.
you know, to that dispossession and just lack of economic empowerment of at least of lots of black South Africans. And we're not making excuses for such xenophobic, you know, behaviors that are going on and attacking fellow Africans who worked so hard to see that South Africans become, you know, free. But if we look at Mugabe's era exclusively, and as if it's mutually exclusive to the rest of other problems, is going to be a challenge. We also need to look inward ourselves. You know, what exactly are we doing? You know, are we empowering our people? Now, having said that, he was a human who turned out also to be flawed. But the other things, I don't know if any of us here watched Mugabe's last speech at the United Nations. It was one of the most statesman-like speech I've heard before the General Assembly in a very long time. It was bold, it was on point, and I think majority of countries in the United Nations General Assembly applauded that speech. I watched every single word of that speech. And so, to a large extent, he was also a very fierce Pan-Africanist, and who believed in not just economic independence, but also the mental and intellectual independence. He was an extremely good speaker. He was extremely a good orator and very eloquent for many years, of course, before he got old. But sometimes when you stay in power, you outlive your usefulness. And so he outstayed his invitation, and he did not know when to go. And I think that is where the challenge is. Even though for a long time he was also a hostage of certain powers, for instance, who never wanted to cede power. So it's a little bit complex. We just can't call him a villain or a hero. We have to put
Doesn't
every
that
stage.
Hassan leave someone to be in a gray area, and we need to make a determination
Yeah.
as to where
We would
this
say-
man
Flawed, I think
we-
is
we
the
would-
term he used.
You cannot judge a man.
Ambassador,
We would say
what,
this.
what lessons do you think we can take away from Mugabe's life and times and his legacy?
Judge a man.
Thank you very much. Let me first of all declare my interest that I knew him very well. And in that, I begin by first of all conveying my condolences to the family and also to the country. And proceed on to say that I want to agree with my neighbor here. Almost 99.9% of what he has said eloquently about Mugabe. I lived in the neighborhood of Zimbabwe for 25 years. I was in Zambia, and I saw Zimbabwe start right from the day of independence growing. And so I was in that country at the inception of independence to see a very strong economy that was actually resting on 4 pillars. On agriculture, very strong. On mining, very strong. On industry, Zimbabwe is one country. When I was a director of industry at some stage, Zimbabwe was actually supplying this country with iron and steel. Because they had very strong industrial base, including iron and steel, and also tourism.
Yes.
Victoria Falls and the rest. Now, how do I remember him? I remember him as a man, I mean, even as he was dying at this age of 95, he was still coherent, articulate. He was a man that had very strict discipline in life, always did exercises, read very well. Few people will remember that he had 4 PhDs, but he never went around telling people of his studies. He was a solid man in his own way. And in law, some of them, he knew his law very well. How did I know him? First of all, having been Secretary General COMESA and at the AU, I worked with him very closely. He was my chairman at COMESA for some time and also at the AU. I sat next to him. I know him. And so I speak from the point of somebody I know. I have even challenged him. I remember, prompted by his Minister of Trade and Industry, who told me, can you ask him how he's implementing this land policy? Whether he's doing the right thing. Naive as I was, in State House, I took him on. We were young and vibrant also. I asked him, Mr. President, many people are just wondering the way you are managing this land crisis. But he saw the naivety in me and the youthfulness. He told me, my son, sit. He lectured me. We were 3 of us in State House for 1 hour plus. And he went through the process. What went wrong? Obviously, and as it has been properly put, at independence, the ratio of ownership of land, 4% owning 90%, was not sustainable. Was not sustainable at all. And so, and it was obvious that this land had to be transferred at some stage. But how was it to be done? The British, because Margaret Thatcher, who negotiated this transition, had promised that the UK would give them resources to be able to transfer land. But when, don't forget John Major and the rest, when they took over, Blair came on, they negated on that, particularly John Major and the rest.
That's true.
And because of that, he felt cheated by the press.
Yes.
And even the politics was also hurting him. When he saw at the end of the day that he was going to face an electorate, the people of Zimbabwe are still poor, he hasn't done anything about land, he then said, okay, if the British are not giving me money, then I am going to repossess land, hoping that they would just move. They didn't. And they went ahead. Of course, he made a slip there by just going ahead to compulsorily take the land, and the way he gave it to the black people was also wrong. In fact, he killed agriculture thereafter.
And he destroyed it.
Exactly. But having done all that, I mean, the Bible said we are all sinners. And so Mugabe made many mistakes in life. And if you look at his profile in life, there was Matebele land, there were all these.
Very bad.
Which he never brought to a close.
Yeah.
But he remained a Pan-Africanist with a strong vision, a man of courage. He's one person who, when disagreed with Mandela on some policies on security. I saw a period when Zimbabwe was under pressure, for instance, from the SADC countries, that you must leave COMESA. He says, no, I'm not going to leave because I know the benefits Zimbabwe. And so he was not a man that you could swing around. And so from that point of view, I can tell you, I find it difficult to talk about him because I saw him as my father, I saw him as my leader, but I obviously made mistakes, but I continue to admire what the goodness in him, and of course the lessons, the question you asked, we must all remember when it is time to move out of power.
Yeah.
Okay, Professor Midamba, I've seen your loose leaf pad is filled with notes.
Oh, no.
How do you remember him?
No, it is important to give all due critics and also positive in terms of his role and what he played. I remember very well the most important, probably famous statement, Ian Smith, that black people will never rule in this land during my time,
Yes.
during my children's time, and during my great-grandchildren's time. And that has now passed. Robert Mugabe educated his people and instilled the value of education. He took land away from the white Zimbabwean, as you have heard. Is the brain behind formation of SADC. Like Fidel Castro, he stood against the white racism. He put an end to white racism. Mugabe is the world's most educated person, educated leader. Now I can go on and go on that way, but now I think Kanenje made a very important statement that he stayed one day longer than his time, and ruined everything that he stood for and that he fight for. He died a very bitter man, from all the information that I get, and least incredible violence against his people, and then he attempted to promote his wife, literally to take over from him, that a lot of people rejected. And so now, remember, George Washington was considered a terrorist by standard. Nelson Mandela was a terrorist. Jomo Kenyatta was a terrorist. So we have to put African leaders on perspective. You know, they're not all angels and they're not all devils. And so that is the story of Robert Mugabe.
Olive, if I can contribute
Yes.
a little bit more. I tend to agree to a certain extent with my colleagues. I'm a bit more critical because I think that if you look at our region, for example, today, we've had in Sudan, in the two Sudans, we've had a movement towards throwing out a military dictator in Sudan. We have had a movement in South Sudan to end tribal war and to bring in multi-party politics. In the whole region, the people, the common man in this region and across the continent, want to have an open society based on a rule of law and open politics. They don't want strong man rule, and they don't want one man overarching on an entire nation. Eritrea, Olive, is a case in which you have another person who has throughout the Ethiopian Derg that was oppressing, killing and destroying the rights of self-determination of the Eritrean people. And they overthrew him and they replaced that Derg with another strong man, another dictator, another person who does not believe in constitutional government. We have to ask ourselves a fundamental question in this continent. Do we want to be ruled by one man who tells us what to do, and he's the law, and that is what we're supposed to do? Or are we going to say it is the common man who has the right to elect the person who wants to rule over him? This is one of the basic questions we have to ask. I am for the latter. I have no question in my mind that Robert Mugabe is a towering Goliath in African political economy. There's no question in my mind about that. Great respect for the kind of stuff that he did in Zimbabwe, but he didn't do it alone. It's the people who are there with him.
Okay, my question then would be, what measuring stick are we using?
That's the question that we need to answer. The question that we need to answer is that it's complex. The human personality in history is complex. But at the end of the day, we want to put, Daniel Arap Moi used to say, meongeza ugali kwa sahani yako. Is the ugali there on your plate? Did healthcare work? Did education work? Was built? Did people get jobs? Or is it what's happening in Zimbabwe today? I understand that the British and the Americans betrayed that man. There's no question in my mind about that. But I'm an Afro-optimist, not one of these Afro-pessimists who believe that just because he didn't get money from the British and the Americans, the country had to go to the dogs.
Okay,
Not
Dr.
acceptable.
Nzau, you know,
Yeah.
are we using, or are we modeling our democracy after the West? And is that wise? And is that perhaps why
Good
we are
question.
referring
Good
to
question.
Robert Mugabe as a strong man?
Yeah, there are three approaches you can take to understand the context of governance or African politics. Professor Naomi Chazen and Rothschild said that first you would have the idea that you can look up to countries that have done it right, where institutions have worked and so on, and ape that. But the neo-Marxist scholars said that how would you learn about democracy from people who enslaved you, colonized you, and continue to run an international economic system that is skewed to their advantage? And part of the problem is that Zimbabwe was mismanaged by people, not only Mugabe, because you may say Mugabe and so on, and you may want to heap all the blame on him, but some of the ills that were committed in these parts were not well weaned out and addressed. For example, if you have a country where 5% own all the land, and it's a purely from a historical racist, invariably exploitative arrangement, and you don't handle it well through the instruments of statecraft, then you're also not handling the country well. I mean, for example, if you let other people, like today, people are being told, if you don't deal with the wars and the insecurity and human insecurity in Africa, you will still continue to get immigrants swimming across the ocean. So if they would have been a little bit fair on Mugabe for that, perhaps they would have handled the problem better, because it's affecting everyone. And the people of Zimbabwe have been quite resilient as a people. They love their country and so on. So the other approach is what you call the statist approach. You can then turn back and say the same way. I think that's what they're telling us here about Mugabe, is that you've been in power forget about the colonialists. You've been here for 60 years, for 50 years. What have you done for your country? You can't just keep looking at the history and saying this is what they did to us. So those three approaches are important. But in the mainstream, what we need to do, we have to build our institutions and build our countries and our economies according to the African condition and according to African needs. If you bring other variables into play, then we will not meet where we want to go.
Okay.
So that's the point.
I will allow you to have the last word on that. I want to bring us home.
Okay.
Yes, Ambassador.
Yes.
Just one last comment on Mugabe.
Yes.
What this reminds me is what Mark Anthony said when he went to bury Caesar. He said, I have come to bury Caesar and not to praise him. The good things that men and women do in their life, I buried with him, but the evil things live after them. Now, obviously, the tension between the good and the evil that people like Mugabe did will continue to play out for a long time to come. And history, I don't know what history will judge him. Some will write it from a point of view of a tyrant, some will as a liberator. But let us look at the good things he did. The liberation of Zimbabwe was not that easy.
No.
It was not easy. And if you look at our leaders especially those who fought for independence and who won independence through bloodbath, they became tyrants, they became dictators, because that is how they had been cultured. In the war itself, never taught them about democracy.
Yes.
They were fighting an evil system, and they had to use evil means, and so that's how they were. In a way, I'm not excusing that evilness in us, but the environment does contaminate us and make us what we are in life.
Okay.
In fact, if you look at the systems of governance we had soon after independence, it was one-party dictatorships throughout Africa, most of it, because they felt entitled and all this. It is only now that we are talking about democracy. But as we talk about democracy, we must learn from history. And I think the point that has been stressed time and again, you should never, in fact, it is always said, the best time to leave a stage is when the audience is on its feet. But we wait until you are knocked out.
Okay, so we've raised the question of strong men. We've seen what happened in Algeria. We've seen what happened in Sudan, where these military leaders were deposed after decades in power and not willing to let go of power. Professor, do you think the leaders on the continent have taken the lesson well, or are we still slow in learning?
Only there are two things I don't accept about us. One is to reach back and say we are behaving the way we are because of colonialism. Secondly, we have not had enough time, to develop. So compare with the West, compare with other places. Now, the point is, if you take Burundi and Rwanda, Kagame in Rwanda, they install a museum, and you will go inside and take a look at how people were murdered, and then you come out not laughing, for a whole day. But he has distilled discipline, and he has focused on making that country much better, governed by black people, by his own people, and forget the French and everything that happened. Burundi is retreating back. It's worse than when colonial people were there. And you look at South Sudan. What do these people want? They're cunning each other, and they've been fighting for independence. Is this the way to go about it? So we, Kenya sometimes describe ourselves as wathogs. Wathogs forget in 1 minute. Anything happen. And so we're continuously repeating this vicious cycle and electing the wrong people, then we blame ourselves. It is time that we shift our mindset, like South Koreans say, shift our mindset into being able to manage our self-sustainability and change the course of Africa, instead of stopping and the open hand for Americans to come and help us, the British come and help, everybody come and help.
Okay.
Got to stop.
Okay. Ahmed, if I come to you, Dr. Kanenje, there are those who take the view that to propel our development, what we need as a continent is a benevolent dictator. Do you share that view?
Nonsense.
I've heard that narrative go around. I think it's because I don't think we've tested real dictatorship sufficiently. There's some of those people who are saying,
agree with that.
Yeah,
I agree with that.
who are saying that they actually don't know how it is.
That's true.
It's not something you actually want to wish for when it actually comes home.
Yeah.
Now, the thing is, I think it's the disillusionment with the project democracy that we've been experimenting with since 1991, 92. That it's leading some Kenyans, that actually Africans at large, to say, I think there is really no hope. Look, we are a democracy. We're experimenting. We're actually trying to have that. But that disillusionment, people see massive corruption. People see complete impunity. And so they start thinking, perhaps if we had a strong man or a strong woman, perhaps it's likely to streamline things. Now, that is not exactly the solution. We have to move towards perfecting our own democracy, make it actually better, make it work for the citizens, for the people. Right now, it's not been working for the people, and I think that is where you hear that.
Yeah.
But trust me, if you want to go the other direction, I don't know how many Kenyans are going to survive that. And in fact, if you think lots of Eritreans have been leaving the country, there will be millions of Kenyans who are going to move out of this place. You know, it is not something pleasant. So I certainly do not. I don't subscribe to that view. However, we need to strengthen our own institutions, build a culture of accountability and democracy, and just get rid of bad manners and bad politicians, like we've been watching in this country for the last several days.
Okay. Last word on that, and then we'll bring it home.
The famous Englishman Shakespeare, in his in the 12th Night, said that some people are born great, some people become great, and some people have greatness thrust upon them. We in this continent have to stand up and be counted in the 21st century that there's some common, basic things that we ought to share. And number one is citizenship. And that means that we have to be governed by a government that we choose. The next thing that we do is that we need to trade among each other and stop depending on the European and American systems for our help. That's another thing. And the last thing that I'd like to say is about Rwanda. I mean, I'm a great admirer of Paul Kagame. I mean, there's no question about what he has done in Rwanda. It's a complete miracle. And every person who stands up and says, oh, we want this authoritarianism, centralism system, and this is, Rwanda is the case for it. But at the end of the day, Kagame is going to die. He's not going to live forever. What happens after Kagame goes? Is there going to be another Kagame that he's going to clone? This is why we need institutions that are going to continue that work. And those institutions have to be based on consensus, on openness and elections. It might take a while to teach them, because at the end of the day, you cannot have elections when half the population wants to murder the other half. It's a luxury. But the education of the people has to go hand in hand with development, so that eventually, like in Tanzania where we had a one-party dictatorship, the leader left, he left a successor, and he said, now move on to the next stage. I think something like that will work in Rwanda. But we cannot keep saying we want to have a one paramount chief over there who tells my mom what to cook for lunch. It's just terrible.
Okay.
So, institutions. We must build our institutions. We have to believe in them, to make them to be living documents, living, so that it's in us.
All right.
Just in concurrence to what you said, I want to talk from a research point of view. Part of a team that has conducted research and written even a book on Africa on how democracy and the economy works. In fact, in Africa now you can categorize countries into more or less like 4 categories. There are those that really enjoy the basic freedoms. There are those that are in transition, and there are those that are in the other extreme left under dictatorship and all these benevolent dictatorships. At the end of the day, how do you measure the quality of life? Because if you look at some of the countries, like the case that has been mentioned, you look at Ethiopia here, neighborhood. It was, in the recent past, was achieving the highest growth rates in the world, actually, 13%, the rest. But people were still not happy. And you saw what happened. They went to the streets and changes occurred. So you cannot split a human being and say, oh yeah, accept the dictatorship here, but so long as you have bread on the table.
Yes.
That you are, you cannot even, you speak in hushed voice because you fear that somebody is listening to you. There is that strong state presence haunting you. The human beings really need that basic freedom to breathe the air, speak their mind, and participate in choosing the government. And I think if you look at the countries that are performing well in the extremes, if you go to countries like Denmark, people are even happy to pay tax because they feel they are part of the state and they're happy. And so the question of saying benevolent dictatorship, it is not something that we should yearn for. It is not something we should dream for.
Of course.
We must continue to pursue, but perfect our own model.
Our own model.
Okay.